Hey there folks, it's me TheTacticalBrit, and Battlefield 5's 5.2 changes is something that's been hotly contested in the community, mostly down to time to kill changes or perceived time to kill changes in the initial blog post that was originally named damage over range balancing. Now in this video today, I'm going to be going through DICE's brand new update on this. They've actually addressed everything regarding the time to kill change and explaining the methodology behind it, but also why, in my opinion, it makes sense. So to start with, we're going to look at the methodology, and to continue, we're going to go in depth onto why some of these changes are happening and why specific guns individually are being changed, and finally, I will give you my opinion on it. So let's dive on in. So in order to understand the direct changes, we need to understand the methodology behind them, and this has been very briefly explained at the very top in a sort of TLDR kind of format. And effectively what they have said is that they are not actually looking to change the time to kill in Battlefield 5. They say they're not interested in changing the lethality of weapons and not changing or punishing skilled players in Battlefield 5. Rather, what they're trying to do is create a much more varied Battlefield experience where weapons are no longer referred to as the sort of go-to guns in Battlefield 5. A good example of this is the Thompson SMG, which is universally used by the vast majority of players, and I think it's safe to say for most people it's seen as the most superior SMG in the class. The background to this all being damage over range. If you change damage over range, you specialize weapons to be either less versatile, more CQB, or intended to be medium-long range weapons. And in doing so, you can create more layers of individuality within individual classes and individuality of weapons. So something like the Suomi will be completely different to any other SMG, and something like the STG will feel very different to many other weapons in the same class set. And I think that's the intended goal here that's been detailed in this blog post. So let's dive on into some of the changes that have actually been made and what DICE have had to say about them. So in short format, what effectively DICE is saying here is that there are a lot of guns that have same damage models because they haven't really balanced the game very well in that circumstance, and one gun can very easily outperform others with very little room for other weaponry. So what you're effectively seeing is that one individual weapon like the MG42 completely reduces most of the other weapons, like for example a VGO, into complete misery because there's simply no other reason to use anything that isn't an MG42 because it has many superior statistics. Even marginally, they don't have to necessarily be one standout figure like the rate of fire, it could just be something as simple as magazine count that makes it a much better weapon to use over the VGO in those circumstances. And that lack of individuality for the VGO means that nobody's using it, it's a waste of a weapon, and any other MMGs that aren't as superior as the MG42 in those scenarios will also be diminished and completely reduced in value. For example, when they added the Browning in the recent update of the Pacific, that was actually one of the most well received in terms of weapons because it actually made a difference. It was a nice trade-off between an MMG that had a good rate of fire if you specialized it towards that, and an MMG that you could use with a good amount of ammunition. It was a great suppressive weapon, and I think it stood out to people because you could play with it in many different ways. And I think that that kind of balancing spec tree slash rate of fire slash ammunition count vision is what they're trying to achieve across the board for every single weapon in the game. What DICE have to say is that Battlefield 5 is currently balanced in what is known as a narrow spectrum. Guns are all damage per second or bullet to kill equal, which means that it's quite easy to find a gun that will work well enough for any situation and stick to that gun. And that creates a number of design problems according to this blog post. Now, it's relatively straightforward if you think about it. Take for example the Thompson, the Suomi, or the Stem. They're all roughly around about a certain number of bullets to kill. Let's say at the moment I think it's 5 bullets to kill up to 20 meters for all of these weapons. That means in this situation the Sten isn't even worth thinking about. It's not even worth using as a weapon. And there are a number of situations where because every single assault rifle, every single SLR, every single weapon that is of a certain classification like SMGs or larger mag semi-auto weapons or even just MMGs, it means that You literally are just choosing statistical advantages. You're choosing the MG42 because it has a superior high rate of fire and a superior mag count, so there is absolutely zero reason to use anything else because they have the same bullet to kill. If I can kill you faster and have lots of ammunition to spare because I'm using a weapon that's the same bullet to kill as something as slow as, for example, I don't even know what the slowest MMG is in the game, probably because I've never used it before, because there just isn't a reason to. And that's exactly the problem they're trying to address here. They're trying to change some of the bullet to kill over ranges for some of these weapons to give them more variation and give them more individuality and incentivize some of the weapons in Battlefield 5 that are completely unused at the moment. What DICE have to say about this is that although they don't want to completely diminish skilled players, the balance caters strongly towards high skilled players who ignore the vast majority of weapons. Someone like myself, I'm not going to say that I'm the elite MLG pro, but I've played enough hours of Battlefield 5 to recognize that some guns are simply superior and those are the weapons that I will be using. It also means that new content is undervalued because people already have favourite weapons and nobody's willing to try anything new. I mean, why would you use the Type 100? It doesn't really offer anything. Why would you use the Arasaka? It's completely useless in my opinion. And I think probably the only... even the M1 Grand, now that I think about it, the M1 Grand is not a good gun. I'm pretty sure people just use it for nostalgia and the aesthetic. The M1 Grand on paper, and in terms of how it performs, is probably one of the worst single/semi-auto fire weapons in the assault class. And there literally is no statistical reason to use it. And I think it shows, because the second we went public into the Pacific, within about 2 games people had already gone back to the guns that they consider to be favourable because they know that they are superior in certain situations. And that lack of variation is what this is addressing here. It also says, finally, the balance doesn't cater towards enough playstyles, leaving a player who isn't necessarily higher skilled without options that may be easier to use but have less overall damage per second. So they're literally trying to reinforce a skill curve here, which I totally agree with. You want to have skill cannon weapons at the very top of the spectrum, which is even detailed in this post. And you also want to have some weapons that are the complete opposite of that at the very other end of the spectrum, but also have good applications. And you want a middle ground of guns that are also varied and can be used in some situations, meaning that you create a good skill curve and also you reinforce a risk versus reward mechanic. If you use a Swomi, you should be very limited to extreme CQB on a weapon that has high recoil but also a really great rate of fire. And that kind of variation means that there's going to be a much larger spectrum of playstyles, a much larger spectrum of uses, and therefore hopefully a much happier player base and a meta that makes more sense. And what DICE have to say about this is that they want to provide a larger variety of playstyles, including skill cannons. They want to create a more discrete range for each weapon class. They also want to create a space in the balance model that will allow them to introduce new weapons with unique gameplay. They want to change the weapon meta to increase the popularity of less popular weapons. And finally, they say they have an anti-vision. This is something they don't want to do. And in this, they say they don't want a change in lethality and average time to kill of the game, especially at close quarters and in flanking situations. They want to make sure that weapons are being used how they're supposed to be. For example, if you're using a semi-automatic rifle at range, you should be successful at medium to long range. But if you're laser beaming somebody with an STG, well, that just doesn't feel right. An STG can kill somebody in 8 bullets up to 100 meters. And realistically it doesn't have any recoil, so it's actually relatively easy to do. And that's provided you don't accidentally get a headshot, meaning that you've cut that down significantly due to the 2x multiplier. So all in all, this is about changing the damage of weapons over ranges in order to create much more variation, increase popularity of weapons, and cater towards more unique styles of gameplay, and reinforce a skill curve. I think that's generally what DICE are going for. And now I want to talk about why this is different to the last time to kill change and also my personal opinion. Now the reason this is different to the last TTK change, the one that completely upheavaled the community and in my opinion was a horrible change, is because that was what is described in the blog post. DICE actually recognize this. They say, look, the reason we screwed this up is because that was a brute force change. They did not compensate ammo, they did not compensate recoil, rate of fire, or spec trees when they did the last time to kill change. And that's exactly why it crumbled before it even got off the ground. In comparison, in this change, they're not actually looking to change the lethality of weapons, but rather offer more variation. They're changing things like rate of fire. You will have different spec trees, rate of fire, recoil, and ammunition counts for the vast majority of weapons in the game when you load up 5.2, meaning that there's good incentive to try lots of different playstyles amongst lots of different weapons. And I think that's something that I personally agree with, and I think it's a good basis. Now, I'm not going to necessarily say that this means that this patch is going to be way better than the last time to kill change, but the methodology is there. On paper, and whether or not that actually works in-game are two separate things, so we'll have to wait and see. Now, what about my personal opinion? Now, I will happily say, without a shadow of a doubt, that I was one of the persons, or people so to speak, that read the time to kill changes in the original blog post and went, why? Like, what are you doing? Is this like a cruel joke or something? And now with this much broader description, which by the way I'm linking in the comment section below, just purely because I have probably only scratched about a third of the surface. I think I've summarized the entire blog post very well, but they actually explain so many different things, like why they're changing certain things. They also explain what they're going to be doing with certain types of playstyles. They get very specific. It's a huge blog post, and I really do recommend reading it if you have the time. Now, with this larger, much more broad and much more intricate blog post, I think I can actually say that I agree with the changes being made on paper. Again, there will always be a sort of grey area until I actually get hands-on, but in terms of what's been explained in the blog post, I would say that their creative vision and reasons for balancing the game are in line with my opinions of how things should be balanced. Now, some people will differ on that opinion, but for me, I think they're making perfect sense. There are entire games, entire regions of Battlefield that I just haven't touched because statistically I know it's not worth it. I know there are guns that just have zero use. I used the M1 Garand for about all of 10 minutes. I used it at the Battlefield event because I wanted people to see the rifle, but after that, it just wasn't worth using. And it shows to me that they're not trying to dumb the game down at all, because they're keeping the headshot multiplier the same, they're not necessarily changing the lethality of weapons within certain ranges, and they're making many adjustments to ensure compensation for when things do change. So for me, that screams something that is a balancing pass and not a time to kill pass, which is what they've said in the blog post. And I think I can happily say that I feel comfortable with the changes. I think what they're doing makes sense. I think it's something that I think right now players will be a little bit upset about because their popular guns are changing, but honestly I think people should just, you know, get with the times and appreciate the fact that the vast majority of some of these weapons were massively badly balanced, and I think it shows that people have just gone so chronically used to the meta in Battlefield 5 that they just don't want it to change. You know, I use the example of the MG42 so frequently because it's a gun that pops up in my mind as being completely undefeatable. It's got such a high rate of fire and high magazine that you can very rarely catch an MG42 player out up to around 50 meters. It doesn't take them very long to kill you. It's almost impossible to counter, and I'm glad that they're making changes to make playstyles more direct. They're making playstyles more varied, and I'm happy to do that. I'm happy to live with that in Battlefield 5. But again, I will not do any of this decisively. I will not say to you that this is going to be the best thing since sliced bread, because I want to try it myself, and only then, and only then, can I definitively say that this is a good change. I do anticipate that they will get some weapons wrong. They will get a few weapons in terms of their balancing a little bit off, but again, just on paper, I think I'm happy with it. Anyways, folks, let me know what you think in the comment section below. Get in touch with your opinions, your ideas, everything you feel about this, and let's have a conversation. Feel free to ask any questions as well, seeing as I've read the entire thing. As always, folks, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.